The first time I realized my neighbors thought they owned me was the day a steel gate slammed shut right in front of my truck, and the man standing behind the keypad smiled while it happened. I still remember the sound, too, that heavy metal clank echoing through the trees like a prison door closing. And for about 3 seconds, I honestly just sat there staring through the windshield thinking, there is no way this is actually happening. Then the guy leaned toward the speaker box and said, "Residents only, sir," like he was enjoying it a little too much. And that's when I understood this wasn't some misunderstanding anymore. Somebody wanted me gone. The crazy part is, they were blocking me from getting to land my own family had owned since Ronald Reagan was president. I inherited the property from my uncle Walter back in 2019 after he passed from lung cancer. The place sat outside a little town in northern Georgia called Belhaven, about 40 minutes from the nearest Walmart, tucked deep behind a newer subdivision called Pine Hollow Estates. 26 acres of woods, an old creek that flooded every spring, and this tiny cedar cabin Walter built himself with his bare hands sometime in the early 80s after his divorce. It wasn't fancy. Half the windows rattled during storms, and the porch sagged a little on the left side, but I loved that place. When I was a kid, Walter used to take me fishing there every summer. We'd sit beside the creek eating cold beans straight from the can while he told stories about Vietnam, bad marriages, and why you should never trust a man who irons blue jeans. He was weird like that. But the older I got, the more I realized the cabin wasn't really about camping for him. It was escape. That land was the only place I ever saw him fully relax. After he died, I kept the property mostly for sentimental reasons. I lived in Atlanta at the time, worked in commercial HVAC, decent money but long hours, and about twice a month I'd drive out to Belhaven just to clear my head for a weekend. No parties, no hunting trips with buddies, nothing loud. I'd fix fence posts, split wood, maybe drink a beer on the porch and listen to the creek at night. Honestly, most people in Pine Hollow probably didn't even know I existed for the first couple years. And that was fine with me. See, the only way into my property was this narrow gravel road called Blackwater Lane. Back in the day, it had been county maintained, but sometime in the 90s the county stopped servicing it during budget cuts, and eventually Pine Hollow's HOA started maintaining the road because it ran directly through their subdivision entrance. My uncle had always had a simple handshake agreement with the developers. They maintained the road. He used it to reach his land. Nobody bothered anybody. Pretty normal small-town stuff. And when I inherited the property, that arrangement just quietly continued. Until Leonard Voss showed up. Leonard moved into Pine Hollow sometime around late 2021, and within 6 months, he somehow became HOA president. Retired Army lieutenant colonel, shaved head, mirrored sunglasses, the kind of guy who says things like standards matter while measuring grass height with a ruler. You know the type. The neighborhood Facebook page practically worshipped him at first because he got streetlights installed and forced people to repaint faded shutters. But the longer he stayed in power, the weirder things got. Cameras went up near the entrance. Then speed bumps. Then these massive signs about trespassing and community security. One afternoon I drove in and noticed construction crews pouring concrete beside the entrance road. A week later, there was a giant black steel gate sitting there with keypad access and security cameras mounted overhead like the entrance to a military base. At first, I figured they'd mail me an access code eventually. They didn't. So I called the HOA office. A woman named Denise answered and sounded nervous before I even finished explaining who I was. She put me on hold for almost 10 minutes. Then Leonard picked up. "You're not a resident of Pine Hollow," he said immediately, flat and cold like he'd rehearsed it already. I told him I understood that, but my property sat behind the subdivision and Blackwater Lane was my only legal access point. Long silence. Then he goes, "You can apply for temporary guest privileges through the board." I actually laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. He said I'd need a background check, an annual road maintenance fee, approval from the HOA committee, and a signed agreement limiting my use of the road. I said, "Leonard, I'm not asking to use your pool. I'm trying to get to my land." And this man really said, "That sounds like your problem, Mr. Mercer." For about 2 days I tried convincing myself maybe Leonard was just one of those guys who got drunk on tiny amounts of power, the kind of person who turns into Napoleon the second somebody hands him a clipboard. And honestly, if he'd just been rude on the phone, I probably would have let it go. But the next Saturday changed everything. I left Atlanta before sunrise, pulling a small trailer loaded with lumber because I planned to replace part of the cabin porch that weekend. It was cold out, fog hanging low across the highway, and the whole drive I kept telling myself there'd probably be an envelope waiting at the gate with an access card or at least some instructions. Instead, when I rolled up to Pine Hollow, the gate was closed tight. No code, no guard, nothing. I pressed the call button once, twice, maybe 6 times. Straight to voicemail every single time. After about 20 minutes, a silver Lexus pulled up behind me, and this older woman leaned out her window looking irritated until she realized I wasn't just parked there for fun. I explained the situation and her whole expression changed. She lowered her voice and said, "Oh, you're the cabin guy." Like everybody in the neighborhood already knew about me. Then she glanced toward the security camera and got weirdly uncomfortable. "Leonard told residents not to give out gate codes," she whispered. "Said there's a liability issue with your property." Liability issue. That phrase sat in my head the whole time she punched in the code and waved me through. I thanked her, but by then my stomach was already turning. Because people only use language like that when they're laying groundwork for something bigger. The entire weekend at the cabin, I couldn't relax. Every sound outside made me look up from what I was doing. Twice I noticed SUVs slowing down near the driveway entrance before driving off. At one point, I even caught myself wondering whether Leonard would tow my truck while I slept. That was the moment I realized something that honestly bothered me more than the gate itself. These people had managed to make me feel unwelcome on my own family's land. Monday morning, I called an attorney named Rebecca Sloan, a property lawyer in Bellhaven who'd handled some probate paperwork after Walter died. Rebecca was one of those sharp, quiet people who never wasted words. Mid-50s, gray streak in her hair, looked like somebody who could dismantle your entire argument while calmly drinking iced tea. I explained the situation, expecting maybe a strongly worded letter at best. Instead, she got very quiet. Then she asked one question. "Did your uncle ever mention easements?" I said I didn't think so. She told me not to contact the HOA again until she reviewed the property records. 3 days later, she called me sounding more energized than I'd ever heard her. "I think your HOA president just made a very expensive mistake," she said. That sentence changed the entire direction of my life. Turns out back in 1984, before Pine Hollow Estates even existed, my uncle Walter owned almost 90 acres out there. Years later, he sold most of the land to developers. But according to old county plats and transfer records, he deliberately retained a narrow strip bordering Blackwater Lane to guarantee permanent access to the cabin property. Not just access rights, ownership rights tied to an easement agreement, which meant the section near the highway, including the exact area where Leonard's precious gate now stood, technically still belonged to Walter's estate, and after probate, to me. Rebecca and I spent nearly 2 weeks digging through old surveys, county maintenance maps, handwritten agreements, tax archives, all this dusty paperwork nobody had touched in decades. Every new document made the situation worse for Pine Hollow. The HOA had spent years paving, widening, and modifying a road section they never legally owned. Worse than that, by blocking my access, they were interfering with a protected easement attached to recorded property rights. In plain English, Leonard had basically built a fortress on top of the wrong man's land. Rebecca sent the HOA a cease and desist letter so aggressive I framed a copy of it later. It demanded immediate removal of the gate from my easement area, restoration of unrestricted access, and compensation for interference with property use. Leonard responded exactly how you'd expect a guy like Leonard to respond. He doubled down, claimed adverse possession, claimed the HOA had maintained the road openly for years and therefore controlled it, claimed I was threatening neighborhood safety. At one point, he even accused me of using the cabin as an unregistered rental operation, which was hilarious considering half the time the place barely had running hot water. But underneath all his bluster, I think Leonard had started panicking. Because once lawyers entered the conversation, facts mattered more than authority, and facts were not on his side. Things escalated fast after that. Pine Hollow residents started recognizing my truck around town. Some treated me like a criminal. Others quietly apologized at gas stations or grocery stores because they'd heard rumors Leonard was trying to remove an outsider from using community roads. One older man actually pulled me aside outside a diner and said, "Son, Leonard's got people convinced you're trying to sue everybody into bankruptcy." That was the moment I realized the HOA board wasn't just fighting me legally anymore. They were fighting a PR war inside the neighborhood too. And honestly, it almost worked. For a little while I became this villain people invented in their heads. The greedy outsider. The guy threatening property values. The cabin owner causing trouble. Never mind the fact I'd done absolutely nothing except ask to reach my own land. But then discovery started. And discovery is where arrogant people usually destroy themselves. Rebecca uncovered emails between Leonard and the HOA board showing they knew there were unresolved ownership questions before installing the gate. One board member even warned them in writing that blocking my access could expose the HOA to litigation. Leonard ignored it. There were also messages where he described me as a long-term nuisance risk, despite never having spoken to me in person more than once. Reading that stuff honestly made my blood boil. This man had built an entire narrative around me without ever bothering to know who I was. To him, I wasn't a person. I was an inconvenience standing in the way of the controlled little kingdom he wanted to run. The court hearing happened in early spring of 2023. Small county courtroom, wood-paneled walls, one squeaky ceiling fan clicking the whole time like something out of an old movie. Leonard showed up in a navy suit surrounded by 3 board members who looked absolutely miserable to be there. Rebecca walked in carrying 2 thick binders and the confidence of somebody who already knew how the story ended. The judge listened for nearly 3 hours while both sides argued easements, access rights, maintenance obligations, and adverse possession claims. Leonard kept trying to frame the issue as community safety. But every time he spoke, Rebecca calmly dragged the conversation back to property law. At one point, she literally laid an enlarged survey map across the courtroom table and said, "Your Honor, the defendant built a restricted access barrier directly on top of my client's inherited easement." You could actually feel the energy shift in the room after that. Leonard stopped making eye contact with me completely. Then came the moment I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. The judge adjusted his glasses, looked over at Leonard, and said, "You do not get to deny someone access to their own property simply because your association finds them inconvenient." Dead silence. Absolute silence. The judge ordered the gate removed from my easement within 30 days, and honestly, for most people, that probably would have been enough. Win the case, get your access back, move on with life. But by that point, this thing had stopped being about a gate. It was about what happens when people get so comfortable with power they forget there are actual human beings on the other side of their decisions. Because while Leonard was busy playing neighborhood commander, I'd spent nearly a year being treated like a trespasser on land my family owned before half those houses even existed. And the craziest part? He never once apologized for any of it. Not privately. Not publicly. Nothing. 2 days after the ruling, Rebecca called me while I was at work and said, "You know, they still need your easement." I remember leaning back in my chair staring at the ceiling for a second while compressors hummed around me in the shop. "What do you mean?" I asked. She explained that although the HOA maintained alternate emergency access through a service trail behind the subdivision, Blackwater Lane remained the primary legal entrance for almost the entire neighborhood. Mail trucks used it. Delivery drivers used it. Contractors used it. Without that section crossing my easement, Pine Hollow's traffic flow turned into a logistical nightmare. The backup route added almost 4 miles through a narrow county road that flooded every heavy rainstorm. Then Rebecca said something that made me laugh out loud right there at work. "Congratulations," she said. "Your neighbors accidentally turned you into infrastructure." That was when I realized the balance of power had completely flipped. Before, Leonard thought I needed Pine Hollow. Now Pine Hollow needed me. Negotiations started the following week. And let me tell you, seeing Leonard suddenly try to act reasonable after months of acting like a dictator was almost surreal. The first meeting happened in the HOA clubhouse. This fake luxury room with leather chairs and framed landscape paintings probably bought in bulk from a hotel supplier. Leonard sat across from me stiff as a statue while 2 attorneys shuffled papers beside him. Rebecca didn't even open her folder at first. She just looked at them and said, "My client is willing to discuss formal usage terms for the easement." Leonard's jaw tightened immediately. "Usage terms," he repeated. "We've maintained that road for years." Rebecca nodded calmly. "And now you'd like to continue using it." I swear I almost smiled right there. The man looked like somebody had poured vinegar into his coffee. They tried every angle at first. Claimed shared community reliance. Claimed historical cooperation. claimed I was exploiting the situation financially. But none of those arguments changed the reality sitting underneath all of it. They had built an HOA-controlled entrance on top of property rights they never bothered to verify. Eventually, the conversation shifted from denial to damage control. That's when the real numbers came out. If Pine Hollow lost unrestricted use of Blackwater Lane, property values throughout the subdivision would likely drop. Insurance rates could increase. Emergency response times would get worse. A few residents had already threatened legal action against the board for mishandling the dispute. Leonard's little power trip had quietly become a financial disaster. We settled 3 weeks later. Pine Hollow HOA agreed to pay me $19,000 for legal damages and interference with property access. On top of that, they signed a permanent renewable easement lease agreement starting at $500 a month with annual increases tied to inflation. $500 may not sound life-changing, but that's not really the point. The point is every single month, the same HOA that once tried locking me out now has to mail me a check for the privilege of using land they thought they controlled. And the fallout inside Pine Hollow? Oh, it got ugly. Residents started demanding board meeting records. People wanted to know why Leonard ignored legal warnings before installing the gate. One family apparently delayed selling their house because buyers got nervous after hearing about the lawsuit. Neighborhood Facebook groups turned into war zones. Some people still blamed me somehow, which honestly says a lot about human nature. But more and more residents started realizing the whole thing could have been avoided if Leonard had simply treated me like a person instead of a problem. About 6 months after the settlement, the HOA held elections. Leonard lost by a landslide. I heard he stood up during the meeting and tried defending himself for almost 20 minutes before somebody in the audience yelled, "You picked a fight with the one guy who actually owned the road." Apparently people laughed. Hard. The new HOA president, a younger woman named Claire Donahue, called me personally a few days later. She apologized for everything, and unlike Leonard, she actually sounded sincere. We talked for nearly an hour. Turns out she'd grown up in Belhaven too, and remembered hearing about my Uncle Walter years earlier. Before hanging up, she asked, carefully, whether I'd consider lowering the lease payment now that management had changed. I looked out across the creek behind the cabin while she waited for an answer. Evening sunlight coming through the trees, water moving slow over the rocks. Same view Walter used to sit and stare at with a beer in his hand after long days. And honestly, for a second, I thought about saying yes. Then I remembered sitting outside that steel gate listening to the voicemail pickup over and over while strangers decided whether I deserved access to my own land. No, I said finally. I think the current arrangement works just fine. There was this little pause on the line. Then Claire laughed softly like she understood completely. These days the gate is still there, just moved back several yards off my easement with a small plaque beside the keypad that says Pine Hollow Private Access. Every time I drive past it on the way to the cabin, I get this weird feeling I can't fully explain. Not revenge exactly. Something quieter than that. Maybe just the satisfaction of knowing my uncle was right all those years ago when he used to say, "Never give away land, and never let proud people think they own you." Funny enough, the whole thing actually made me more protective of that property. I spend more time there now than I ever used to. Fixed the porch, repainted the cabin, cleared part of the creek bank last fall. Sometimes at night I sit outside listening to the woods and think about how close I came to losing access to all of it because one man got addicted to authority inside a suburban neighborhood. And I still wonder sometimes, if the records hadn't existed, if Rebecca hadn't dug through those old county archives, would anybody in Pine Hollow have cared whether what they were doing was right? Or would convenience have mattered more than fairness? Honestly, I don't know. But I'd love to hear what you think. Was I justified for charging the HOA after everything they put me through? Or should I have let it go once the court ruled in my favor? Let me know down in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about property disputes, HOA drama, and people learning expensive lessons the hard way, make sure to like the video and subscribe because trust me, this wasn't the last crazy fight I've seen over a piece of land.